A racist teacher repeatedly humiliates a student, but what she didn't know is that she would be the one to learn the biggest lesson. Ethan Carter, a brilliant boy, faced a powerful enemy: subtle prejudice. In a classroom where his voice was silenced, he discovered the strength of words. With the support of someone unexpected, he started a revolution that would change the school forever. This is an emotional journey about bullying, resilience, consequences, and overcoming. Get ready. This story will move you until the very last second. The wide corridors of Coleridge Academy were impeccably clean, with polished floors reflecting the sunlight streaming through tall windows. The walls were adorned with achievements of students from past years, photos of academic competitions, trophies, and framed certificates. Everything about the place exuded tradition and excellence. Ethan Carter adjusted his tie as he walked nervously toward his classroom. He was a 14-year-old boy with warm brown skin, short curly black hair, and deep dark brown eyes. The navy blue blazer and white shirt of his uniform were neatly pressed, but no matter how much he straightened his appearance, he couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. This wasn't his first time at a new school. His family had moved several times because of his father's work, but Coleridge Academy was different. The prestigious institution prided itself on its elite status, and the weight of its reputation hung heavy in the air. As Ethan entered the classroom, the buzz of chatter among the students died down. 30 pairs of eyes turned toward him, scanning him from head to toe. His steps faltered slightly as he walked toward the teacher's desk, but he straightened his posture and introduced himself. "Good morning. My name is Ethan Carter," he said, his voice steady but soft. The teacher, Miss Whitaker, stood behind her desk. She was a middle-aged woman with pale skin, sharp blue eyes, and blonde hair tied tightly in a bun. Her gray blazer and pencil skirt completed her strict, no-nonsense demeanor. She glanced at Ethan briefly, her expression unreadable. "Take a seat, Mr. Carter," she said curtly, motioning toward an empty desk in the middle of the room. As Ethan walked to his seat, he couldn't help but notice the faint whispers and smirks from some of the other students. His face grew warm, but he kept his gaze forward and sat down quietly. The day progressed slowly. Miss Whitaker's teaching style was precise and authoritative, leaving little room for interaction. Ethan listened intently, jotting down notes and trying to focus, but he couldn't ignore the subtle glances and occasional snickers directed his way. During a discussion about classic literature, Ethan raised his hand hesitantly. "Yes, Carter?" Miss Whitaker asked, her tone sharp. "I think this part of the story highlights the character's struggle against societal expectations," Ethan began, his voice gaining confidence. Miss Whitaker's eyebrows arched slightly, and a faint smirk played on her lips. "Interesting perspective, but I suggest you focus on what's in the text rather than extrapolating beyond the material," she replied. The room went silent. Ethan felt the sting of her words, but he simply nodded and looked down at his notebook. Around him, a few students exchanged amused glances. By the end of the day, Ethan felt drained. As the final bell rang, he packed his things and walked out of the classroom, his steps heavy. Outside, the afternoon sun bathed the school grounds in a golden glow. Ethan paused for a moment near the gates, adjusting his backpack. He looked back at the imposing building, its tall windows gleaming in the light. "This is just the first day," he whispered to himself, determination flickering in his eyes. "I'll find a way to make this work." The following days at Coleridge Academy began to reveal the true dynamics of the classroom. Ethan quickly noticed that Miss Whitaker had a particular way of running her lessons, rigid control that left little room for deviation. Any attempt he made to participate was often met with veiled resistance. One morning, during a discussion about The Great Gatsby, Miss Whitaker posed a question about the novel's central themes, encouraging students to draw connections to contemporary examples. Ethan hesitated but raised his hand, determined to contribute. "Yes, Carter?" Miss Whitaker asked, her tone neutral but edged with expectation. "I think, In addition to economic privilege, it's important to highlight how racism intersects with class in the story. The society portrayed in the book not only divides people by wealth, but also by race and background, Ethan said, his voice gaining confidence as he explained his point. The classroom grew uncomfortably quiet. Some students exchanged glances, and a few smirked. Miss Whitaker crossed her arms and gave a faint, dismissive smile. An interesting perspective, she said, her tone devoid of warmth. But I would advise you to focus on the literary aspects of the text. This isn't a sociology class. Ethan felt his face flush, but he stayed silent, staring down at his notebook. He knew his analysis was valid, but Miss Whitaker's response made it clear that his voice wasn't welcome. Over the next few days, small acts began to pile up. Whenever Ethan raised his hand, it seemed as if Miss Whitaker deliberately overlooked him, calling on other students instead. When she did acknowledge him, her tone was often clipped, her feedback sharp. "Carter, your interpretations are a bit ambitious," she remarked one day as she handed back his assignment. Some students began to follow her lead. During group work, Ethan noticed a few classmates whispering and chuckling to themselves whenever he spoke. It wasn't overt bullying, but the undercurrent of exclusion was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, Miss Whitaker handed out a surprise quiz. The students were instructed to answer a single question orally in front of the class. When it was Ethan's turn, he stood and began explaining his thoughts. He barely got through the first sentence before Miss Whitaker interrupted him. "Let's stop there, Carter," she said, raising a hand. "It seems you didn't quite understand the question." "But Ethan started, only to be cut off. "Next," Miss Whitaker barked, turning to another student. Ethan sat back down, his face burning with humiliation as a few students stifled laughter. That evening, Ethan sat quietly at the dinner table, pushing his food around on his plate. His father, Marcus Carter, noticed his son's unusual silence. "Something wrong, Ethan?" Marcus asked, setting down his fork. Ethan hesitated, but then let the words spill out. He told his father about Miss Whitaker's constant interruptions, her dismissive comments, and how she seemed to single him out in class. "She treats me like I don't belong there, like I'm not good enough," Ethan said, his voice trembling with frustration. Marcus listened intently, his expression growing more serious with every word. "Have you noticed if she does this to anyone else?" Marcus asked. "No," Ethan replied firmly. "It's just me." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening as he considered his son's words. "All right, Ethan," he said. "Let's keep observing for now, but I promise you we'll handle this. You're not alone in this fight." Ethan nodded, feeling a glimmer of relief. He felt like someone was truly on his side. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, he stared at the ceiling and replayed the day's events in his mind. He didn't know how, but he was determined to find a way to confront the growing tension at Coleridge Academy. The days continued to pass, but Miss Whitaker's behavior toward Ethan only worsened. Her actions were subtle enough to seem justified, but the pattern was undeniable. Ethan was being targeted. He wasn't just ignored during discussions. He was deliberately placed in situations that humiliated him or left him feeling inferior. Each class seemed to bring a new challenge. Miss Whitaker often interrupted him mid-sentence or dismissed his ideas with a faint smirk. Her comments had a sharp edge, undermining his confidence in a way that felt calculated. During a lesson on Shakespeare's Othello, she assigned Ethan to read a passage aloud. He began, his voice steady and clear, but she interrupted him almost immediately. "Ethan, you need to work on your diction. It's important that everyone understands what you're reading," she said in a clipped tone, her arms crossed. Some students chuckled softly, and Ethan's face flushed with embarrassment. He knew his reading had been fine. Her critique had nothing to do with his performance. This wasn't an isolated incident. Miss Whitaker seemed to find fault with him at every opportunity, often using his mistakes, real or imagined, to highlight his shortcomings. "Carter, it seems you're struggling to keep up with the pace of the class," she said one day, after correcting him on a minor point during a discussion. Ethan began to realize that her comments weren't just about his academic abilities. There was an underlying prejudice in the way she spoke to him, a constant implication that he didn't belong. The worst moment came during a writing assignment. Students were asked to submit an essay on a topic of their choice. Ethan chose to write about the importance of cultural diversity in education, a subject close to his heart. When Miss Whitaker returned his paper, Ethan's heart sank. The essay was covered in red ink, with comments that stung. Ambitious, but overly complicated. One note read, "Stick to simpler topics you can handle," said another. Ethan felt the weight of her words settle heavily on his shoulders. It wasn't just criticism, it was dismissal, a blatant refusal to see the effort and thought he'd put into his work. The morning began like any other at Coleridge Academy. Ethan walked into the classroom with his head held high, determined to make it through the day. The tension between him and Miss Whitaker had reached its peak, and he could sense that something was bound to give. That day, the students were scheduled to present group projects on modern literature. Ethan's group, which included Sarah and 2 other classmates, had worked hard to analyze Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, focusing on themes of systemic racism and personal resilience. As Ethan stood at the front of the classroom to deliver his portion of the presentation, he felt a mix of nervousness and pride. He spoke clearly and confidently, explaining how the author's experiences reflected larger societal issues. He had barely finished his first point when Miss Whitaker raised her hand to interrupt. "Carter, let's stick to analyzing the text itself," she said sharply. "This isn't a political debate." Ethan paused, taking a deep breath. "With all due respect, Miss Whitaker, the social context is crucial to understanding this text." "It's impossible to separate the two," he replied, his voice steady. The classroom fell silent. Some students exchanged nervous glances, while others leaned forward, curious to see what would happen next. Miss Whitaker's expression hardened. "That may be your opinion," she said, her tone laced with condescension. "But in academic settings, we focus on what's within the text, not on personal interpretations or external theories." Ethan felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but before he could respond, Sarah spoke up. "Actually, Miss Whitaker, our research included several academic sources that highlight the importance of context in analyzing this book. We'd be happy to share those with the class." Miss Whitaker's lips tightened as she nodded curtly. "Fine. Continue," she said, stepping back. The group finished their presentation, but the tension lingered in the air. Ethan returned to his seat, feeling both proud of his group's effort and frustrated by the constant pushback. After class, as the students filed out, Miss Whitaker stopped Ethan. "Carter, a word," she said, her tone icy. Ethan approached her desk cautiously. "You need to learn to stay within the bounds of what's expected," she began, folding her arms. "Your insistence on bringing up these perspectives is becoming a distraction." Ethan clenched his fists at his sides, but his voice remained calm. "I'm not trying to be a distraction. I'm just trying to contribute to the discussion," he said firmly. Miss Whitaker's eyes narrowed. "I'll be writing a note to the academic advisor about your behavior. Perhaps they can help you refocus your efforts," she said, dismissing him with a wave of her hand. Ethan left the classroom, his chest tight with frustration. He knew he was fighting a battle that went beyond simple classroom disagreements. That evening, he recounted the day's events to his father. Marcus listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "This has gone too far," Marcus said finally. "I'll be speaking with the principal tomorrow." Ethan nodded, relieved but apprehensive. He knew his father's involvement could escalate the situation, but he also felt a flicker of hope. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the school unannounced and requested to observe another one of Miss Whitaker's classes. Sitting quietly at the back of the room, He watched as Ethan once again raised his hand to participate in a discussion. Miss Whitaker called on him reluctantly. Her tone clipped. "Carter, let's see if you can keep your response concise this time," she said. Ethan delivered a thoughtful answer, only for Miss Whitaker to dismiss it with a vague, "Not quite what I was looking for." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. He took detailed notes, determined to address the issue head-on. After class, Marcus went straight to the principal's office. "This isn't just a matter of teaching style," he told Mrs. Blake, his voice firm. "This is a pattern of behavior that is targeting my son and undermining his confidence. I won't let this continue." Mrs. Blake listened carefully, nodding as Marcus laid out the evidence he'd gathered. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Mr. Carter," she said. "I'll take immediate action to address the situation." Marcus left the office feeling a sense of relief, but he knew the fight wasn't over. As he walked to his car, he thought about Ethan. The atmosphere in the principal's office was tense. Marcus Carter sat across from Mrs. Blake, the head of Coleridge Academy, his posture firm and commanding. His tailored dark gray suit and burgundy tie added to his air of authority, but it was the determined look in his deep brown eyes that dominated the room. "Mrs. Blake," Marcus began, his voice measured but firm, "I've observed my son's class, and what I witnessed today confirms what he has been telling me. This is not just a matter of teaching style. This is targeted behavior." The principal, a middle-aged woman with light skin and sharp green eyes, adjusted her glasses, clearly uneasy. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Carter," she said. "But Miss Whitaker is one of our most experienced teachers. I find it hard to believe that she would act with any intent to discriminate." Marcus leaned forward slightly, placing a neatly organized stack of papers on her desk. "These are notes and comments from Ethan's assignments," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of steel. "Notice the consistent tone of dismissal. These aren't constructive critiques. They're meant to undermine him. And during the class I observed, she singled him out repeatedly, even when his responses were valid and thoughtful." Mrs. Blake picked up the papers and scanned them, her brows furrowing as she read. The evidence was hard to ignore. "This is concerning," she admitted, her voice faltering. "It's more than concerning," Marcus said, his tone growing sharper. "It's unacceptable. Ethan is a bright, capable student, and instead of nurturing his potential, she's tearing him down. That stops now." Mrs. Blake nodded slowly, clearly understanding the seriousness of the situation. "I will have a conversation with Miss Whitaker and begin a formal review of her behavior," she said. "That's not enough," Marcus interjected. "I want to speak with her myself. She needs to understand the impact of her actions, not just on Ethan, but on every student who looks to their teacher for guidance and fairness." After a moment of hesitation, Mrs. Blake agreed. She called Miss Whitaker to the office. A few minutes later, the door opened, and Miss Whitaker stepped in. Her posture was rigid, and her expression was one of barely concealed irritation. "Mr. Carter," she said curtly, nodding in his direction before turning to the principal. "What is this about?" "Miss Whitaker," Mrs. Blake began, her tone neutral. "Mr. Carter has raised serious concerns about your treatment of his son Ethan." Miss Whitaker's brows furrowed, and she crossed her arms defensively. "With all due respect, I hold all my students to the same high standards," she said. "If Ethan feels singled out, perhaps it's because he isn't meeting those standards." Marcus stood, his tall frame towering over her as he spoke calmly but firmly. "Miss Whitaker, I'm not here to argue about standards. I'm here to address a pattern of behavior that is unmistakable." Interrupting him, dismissing his work, and undermining his confidence. These are not the actions of a teacher fostering excellence. They are the actions of someone who has allowed bias to cloud their judgment. Miss Whitaker's pale face flushed slightly, but she kept her expression neutral. "I treat all my students equally," she said, her voice clipped. "No, you don't," Marcus said, his tone cutting through the tension. "And if you truly believe that, then perhaps it's time to reflect on your actions. This isn't just about Ethan. It's about the message you're sending to every student in that classroom. What you see as rigor, others see as prejudice. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Marcus's words hanging heavily in the air. Mrs. Blake cleared her throat, breaking the tension. Miss Whitaker, given the seriousness of these concerns, I am placing you on suspension while we conduct a full investigation, she said firmly. Miss Whitaker's mouth opened as if to protest, but no words came out. She glanced at Marcus, whose steady gaze remained unwavering, and then turned back to Mrs. Blake. Understood, she said. After Miss Whitaker left the room, Mrs. Blake turned to Marcus. Mr. Carter, I assure you that this matter will be handled thoroughly, she said. I expect nothing less, Marcus replied. And I will follow up to ensure that real change happens, not just for Ethan, but for every student at this school. As he left the office, Marcus felt a sense of resolve. He had taken the first step in holding the school accountable, but he knew there was still more to do. When he picked up Ethan that evening, his son looked at him with a mix of curiosity and hope. How did it go? Ethan asked. Marcus smiled faintly, resting a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. It's a start, he said, but the real change comes next. The suspension of Miss Whitaker sent shockwaves through Coleridge Academy. Students whispered in the hallways, exchanging curious glances whenever Ethan passed by. Some seemed relieved by her absence, while others, particularly those who had benefited from her favoritism, grumbled about the fairness of the decision. For Ethan, the change was palpable. Walking into the classroom without the weight of Miss Whitaker's gaze felt like stepping into a brighter space. However, the scars of her actions still lingered. He knew this was only the beginning of a much larger process. Meanwhile, Mrs. Blake, the school's principal, recognized that Miss Whitaker's behavior was not an isolated incident. As she reviewed the evidence Marcus Carter had presented, it became clear that the school's culture needed significant change. She called an emergency meeting with the faculty to address the issue. In the teacher's lounge, the air was heavy with tension. Mrs. Blake stood at the front of the room, her posture straight and her green eyes sharp. You are all aware of the situation involving Miss Whitaker and one of our students, she began, her tone calm but firm. This is not just about one teacher or one student. This is about ensuring that Coleridge Academy lives up to its values of fairness, inclusion, and respect. Some teachers nodded in agreement, while others exchanged wary glances. One, a history teacher named Mr. Aldridge, raised his hand. With all due respect, Mrs. Blake, are we sure we're not overreacting? Miss Whitaker is a strict educator, but I don't think that equates to bias. Mrs. Blake's gaze hardened. Rigor and discrimination are not the same, she replied. And if any of you believe otherwise, I encourage you to reflect on how your actions and words impact your students. This is a moment for us to grow, not to resist change. The room fell silent. Mrs. Blake outlined a series of steps the school would take, including mandatory training on diversity and inclusion for all staff, and a thorough review of classroom practices. At the same time, Marcus Carter took further action. He requested a meeting with the school's board of directors to discuss broader reforms. Sitting in the boardroom, he presented a proposal to create a diversity committee composed of students, parents, and teachers that would oversee initiatives to promote equity and inclusion. Change doesn't happen in isolation, Marcus said, his voice steady. It requires commitment from every level of this institution. I'm not here to dismantle Coleridge Academy. I'm here to help it live up to its potential. The board members, moved by his words and the evidence he presented, voted unanimously to approve the initiative. Back in the classroom, Ethan began to notice subtle but meaningful shifts. Teachers who had previously been indifferent now seemed more engaged, ensuring that all students had a chance to participate. His classmates, particularly Sarah, showed increased solidarity. Ethan, I'm glad you spoke up, Sarah said, one day after class. It's making a difference, Not just for you but for everyone. Ethan smiled, appreciating her support, but knowing there was still more to do. A few weeks later, the school hosted an open assembly to address the changes being implemented. For the first time, students were invited to share their experiences and ideas in a public forum. Ethan, though nervous, decided to speak. Standing at the microphone in the auditorium, he looked out at the crowd of students, teachers, and parents. "When I first came to Coleridge Academy, I thought the problem was me," he began, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "But I've realized that it's not about one person. It's about how we treat each other. Every student deserves to feel seen, heard, and valued." The room was silent as his words sank in. Ethan took a deep breath and continued. "This isn't about blaming anyone. It's about learning, growing, and making sure that no one else has to feel the way I did. And I know we can do that together." The crowd erupted into applause. Ethan stepped back from the microphone, his heart pounding, but a small smile crept across his face. As the assembly ended, Marcus stood in the back of the room, watching his son with pride. "That's my boy," he thought, his chest swelling with both relief and admiration. The assembly marked a turning point for Coleridge Academy. For the first time, the issues that had simmered beneath the surface were brought into the open, and the atmosphere of the school began to change. Conversations about inclusion and fairness were no longer whispered. They were out in the open. Ethan felt a subtle but significant shift. The judgmental stares and occasional smirks he once endured in the hallways were replaced with smiles and nods of acknowledgement. Some students approached him directly. "Ethan, your speech really opened my eyes," one boy admitted, his voice sincere. "I didn't realize how much was going on." Ethan thanked him, though he wasn't entirely sure how to process the sudden attention. He appreciated the support but remained cautious, knowing that change takes time. Sarah, now one of Ethan's closest allies, became even more vocal in advocating for change. Together, they discussed ideas to further the progress made by the assembly. "What if we started a diversity club?" Sarah suggested one afternoon as they sat in the library. "A place where people can share their experiences and learn from each other." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "That could work," he said. "But we need to make sure it's more than just talk. It has to lead to real action." Meanwhile, not everyone embraced the changes. Some teachers and students resisted, dismissing the new initiatives as overreactions. Lucas, a classmate who had often mocked Ethan, was particularly vocal. "Now we have to tiptoe around everything," Lucas complained during a group discussion. "Can't even disagree with someone without being called a racist." The substitute teacher, who had taken over Miss Whitaker's class, intervened calmly. "Disagreement is fine, Lucas," she said. "But it needs to come from a place of respect, not prejudice. That's what we're trying to teach here." Ethan, who had grown used to comments like Lucas's, stayed quiet but felt a surge of quiet satisfaction at the teacher's response. Outside of the classroom, Marcus Carter continued to advocate for structural change. The Diversity Committee, now formally established, held its first meeting with representatives from the student body, faculty, and parents. Ethan was invited to join as one of the student voices, and he felt both honored and nervous. During the meeting, Ethan shared his thoughts candidly. "The curriculum needs to reflect more perspectives," he said. "Most of the books we read only show one side of the story. If we want to teach students to think critically, we need to give them a wider range of voices to learn from." The committee agreed, and plans were made to diversify the reading lists and implement workshops for teachers on cultural competence. The highlight of the semester came in the form of a cultural fair organized by the committee. Students were invited to create booths showcasing their heritage, traditions, and experiences. Ethan and Sarah worked tirelessly to make the event a success. On the day of the fair, the school gymnasium was transformed into a vibrant celebration of diversity. Booths adorned with colorful decorations, artifacts, and foods from various cultures filled the space. Ethan stood at his booth, which highlighted the importance of representation in literature. As students and teachers stopped by to read the quotes and essays he had displayed, he felt a sense of pride he hadn't experienced in months. Sarah approached him with a wide smile. "Look around," she said, gesturing to the bustling gym. "This is because of you." Ethan shook his head, smiling. "It's because of all of us," he replied. At the end of the day, Marcus arrived to pick Ethan up. Watching his son interact confidently with his classmates, Marcus felt a deep sense of pride. "You've done something incredible here, Ethan," Marcus said as they walked to the car. Ethan smiled, feeling lighter than he had in months. "It's just the beginning, Dad," he said, "but it's a good start." The progress made at Coleridge Academy was undeniable. The conversation sparked by Ethan's speech and the cultural fair began to ripple through the school, leading to real changes in both attitudes and policies. One of the most visible changes was the transformation of the curriculum. Books by authors from diverse backgrounds were added to the reading list, and teachers were encouraged to bring in materials that reflected a broader range of experiences. Workshops on cultural sensitivity and unconscious bias became mandatory for all faculty, creating opportunities for reflection and growth. For Ethan, these changes were welcome but bittersweet. The lingering scars from Miss Whitaker's treatment couldn't be erased overnight. Still, he felt a sense of hope every time he walked into a classroom and saw his teachers engaging students with empathy and fairness. One afternoon, during a session of the newly established Voices Circle, Ethan found himself moved by the stories of his peers. The initiative, which created a safe space for students to share their experiences, had quickly become one of the most impactful changes in the school. Aisha, a quiet student who wore a hijab, spoke for the first time during the meeting. "I've been here for 3 years," she began, her voice soft but steady. "And until now, I never felt like I could talk about what it's been like. People make comments about my hijab or ask me why I wear it, as if it's something strange. It made me feel like I didn't belong." Ethan listened intently, his heart aching at the familiarity of her words. "You're not alone," he said when it was his turn to speak. "And I'm glad you're sharing this, because that's how we start to change things." The room filled with nods of agreement, and for the first time, Aisha smiled. Meanwhile, Marcus Carter continued his efforts to ensure the changes at Coleridge Academy would last. He worked closely with the Diversity Committee to establish a fund dedicated to supporting inclusion programs and bringing in guest speakers to educate both students and staff. "This isn't just about my son," Marcus said during a meeting with the committee. "It's about creating a foundation that will benefit every student who walks through these doors." The school's progress wasn't without resistance. Some parents voiced concerns about the new initiatives, claiming they were unnecessary or politically motivated. Marcus, however, was prepared to address them head-on. "Equality and fairness are not political," he said during a parent-teacher forum. "They're fundamental values. And if we want our children to succeed, we need to teach them how to respect and understand one another." By the end of the semester, the cultural fair stood out as the highlight of the school year. Students and teachers alike marveled at the creativity and passion displayed at the event. Ethan, who had initially been hesitant about his involvement, now walked through the gymnasium with pride. As the day ended, Sarah approached him, holding a notebook filled with ideas for future projects. "We could turn the Voices Circle into a mentorship program," she suggested, her enthusiasm contagious. Older students could help new ones feel welcomed and supported. Ethan grinned. "I think that's a great idea," he said. Later, as he and Marcus stood outside the school, watching the sunset cast a golden glow over the campus, Ethan felt a deep sense of accomplishment. "I'm proud of you, Ethan," Marcus said, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. "Thanks, Dad," Ethan replied. "But there's still so much to do. And you're the right person to lead the way," Marcus said with a smile. As the school gates closed behind them, Ethan realized that while the journey had been difficult, it was far from over. But he felt ready to face whatever came next. The semester at Coleridge Academy was coming to a close, but the changes set in motion felt like the beginning of something much larger. The atmosphere in the school was no longer suffocating for Ethan. Instead, it carried a sense of possibility and growth. The Voices Circle had become a staple of the school's weekly schedule, drawing students from every grade. Stories once silenced by fear or shame now echoed through the classroom walls, creating a ripple effect of empathy and understanding. Ethan's confidence grew with each session, not just because of the stories he shared, but because he realized how much others valued his voice. One afternoon, after a particularly emotional Voices Circle session, Ethan stayed behind to help rearrange the chairs. Aisha, who had become more comfortable sharing her experiences, approached him. "Thank you for speaking up that day," she said quietly. "It gave me the courage to do the same." Ethan smiled. "It's not easy, but I think we're all stronger when we're honest about what we're going through," he said. Meanwhile, the Diversity Committee, led by Marcus Carter and Mrs. Blake, implemented lasting reforms. One of the most significant changes was the introduction of a mentorship program. Ethan was one of the first students chosen to serve as a mentor, helping younger students navigate the challenges of school life. He quickly realized that his experiences, once a source of pain, had become a powerful tool to help others. "I used to think I had to handle everything alone," Ethan told his mentee, a nervous sixth grader. "But what I've learned is that it's okay to ask for help. And it's okay to speak up when something isn't right." The mentorship program flourished, creating bonds between students that transcended grade levels and backgrounds. For Ethan, it was a reminder of how far he had come. As the semester drew to a close, the school organized a closing ceremony to celebrate the progress that had been made. Students, teachers, and parents gathered in the auditorium, and the energy in the room was electric. Ethan was invited to speak once again. Standing at the podium, he took a deep breath and looked out at the crowd. "This semester has been hard, but it's also been the most important one of my life," he began. "I've learned that change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without courage. But I've also learned that when we stand together, we can create something better." The audience erupted in applause, and Ethan stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding but his smile wide. After the ceremony, Marcus found Ethan in the hallway. "You did it, Ethan," Marcus said, pride shining in his eyes. "We did it, Dad," Ethan replied. As they walked out of the school together, Ethan felt lighter than he had in months. The challenges he had faced hadn't disappeared, but he now had the tools and the support to overcome them. This is just the beginning, he thought, looking back at the school one last time. And for the first time in a long while, the future felt full of hope.
Hi, this is Ethan. Being discriminated against and bullied deeply impacts our lives and mental health. Fortunately, I had support and important changes were made. But I want this to happen for everyone facing similar situations. If you enjoyed my story and believe it can inspire others, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story